Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling completely disoriented, unsure of what was said, what was meant, or how the discussion suddenly turned into your fault? You replay the words in your mind, trying to make sense of it, wondering how something so simple became so complicated. That confusion isn't random. It's not miscommunication, and it's not because you're bad at explaining yourself. In toxic dynamics, confusion is often used as a weapon. Today, we're talking about how narcissistic behavior uses confusion to gain power, why it works so well, and what you can do to protect your clarity. Confusion is not accidental when you are dealing with narcissistic toxicity. It is intentional, calculated, and used with precision. At first, it may appear subtle, almost harmless. A small contradiction here, a changed detail there. You might think they simply forgot, misunderstood, or misspoke. But over time, a pattern emerges. Conversations begin clearly and end in chaos. Simple questions turn into emotional debates. Facts blur. Timelines shift. You leave interactions feeling mentally drained, unsure of what actually happened, and questioning your own understanding. This confusion serves a purpose. When someone cannot control you directly, they work to control your perception. If they can make you unsure of reality, they don't need to prove anything. They don't need logic, truth, or consistency. All they need is your doubt. Confusion weakens your confidence, and once confidence erodes, influence increases. You begin explaining yourself more, overthinking your words, rehearsing conversations before they happen, and replaying them long after they end. Narcissistic toxicity thrives in this mental fog. Clear communication threatens them because clarity exposes patterns. Clarity reveals contradictions. Clarity invites accountability. Confusion, on the other hand, protects them from all three. When nothing is clear, nothing can be proven. When stories constantly change, responsibility disappears. When the conversation feels chaotic, they can always claim misunderstanding rather than wrongdoing. You may notice how often the focus shifts away from the original issue. You bring up something specific that hurt you, and suddenly the conversation is about your tone, your timing, your attitude, or your past. The original concern vanishes, replaced by a new argument you never intended to have. This redirection is not random. It keeps you reacting instead of addressing the behavior itself. Another layer of confusion comes through emotional inconsistency. One moment they are warm and affirming, the next they are cold or dismissive. This unpredictability destabilizes you. Your nervous system stays on alert, trying to anticipate which version of them you'll encounter. That emotional imbalance makes it harder to think clearly and easier to comply just to restore peace. Over time, you may find yourself asking for clarification repeatedly, hoping that if you explain better, choose better words, or stay calmer, the conversation will finally make sense. But clarity never comes because confusion is the strategy, not the mistake. Each attempt you make to understand pulls you deeper into the cycle. You begin to doubt your memory, your reactions, even your emotional instincts. This is how confusion becomes control. When you are uncertain, they appear certain. When you hesitate, they speak confidently. When you question yourself, their version of events feels stronger simply because it is delivered without doubt. Confidence, even when false, can overpower truth when the other person has been destabilized. The most damaging part is how quietly this happens. There is rarely one explosive moment. Instead, confusion builds slowly, layer by layer, until your internal compass feels unreliable. You stop trusting what you see and feel. You rely more on their interpretation than your own experience. And once that happens, they no longer need to dominate the conversation because the confusion does the work for them. This is why toxic conversations leave you exhausted rather than resolved. Your mind has been working overtime trying to organize disorder. You weren't having a discussion. You were navigating intentional chaos. They changed the story not because they forgot, but because control depends on instability. What was said yesterday suddenly never happened today. A clear statement becomes a joke. A promise turns into something you misunderstood. When you bring up their exact words, they deny the meaning, shift the context, or claim you're remembering it wrong. This constant rewriting of events slowly disconnects you from your own memory and replaces it with uncertainty. At first, the changes seem minor. A detail is missing. A timeline is adjusted. A phrase is interpreted differently. You may even give them the benefit of the doubt, assuming everyone remembers things differently. But healthy disagreement still stays anchored in reality. In toxic communication, reality itself becomes negotiable. The facts are never stable, only whatever version serves them in that moment. When the story keeps changing, your mind tries to keep up. You replay conversations trying to pinpoint where things shifted. You search for proof in messages, tones, or expressions. You start documenting what was said, not because you want to argue, but because you no longer trust that the truth will remain intact. This mental effort is exhausting, and exhaustion makes resistance harder. The deeper problem isn't the changed story itself, but the doubt it creates inside you. You begin asking yourself if you heard it correctly, if your emotions distorted your memory, if you're being unfair. That doubt is powerful because once you question yourself, you stop questioning them. The focus shifts inward, away from accountability and toward self-blame. They often reinforce this by speaking with certainty. Their voice stays calm while yours becomes defensive. Their version is delivered confidently while yours feels shaky because you're trying to recall details under pressure. Confidence begins to look like truth even when it isn't. Over time, you may start accepting their narrative simply because arguing feels pointless. This tactic is especially damaging because it attacks your sense of trust in yourself. When someone repeatedly tells you that your memory is flawed, your emotions are exaggerated, or your perception is wrong, you internalize that message. You hesitate before speaking. You second-guess your reactions. You wonder whether you're the problem. The story changes also keep conversations endless. There is never a resolution because the foundation keeps moving. You cannot solve an issue when the facts keep resetting. Every attempt to gain clarity is met with another revision. This keeps you trapped in explanation mode, always trying to catch up to a version of reality that keeps slipping away. As this continues, you may notice how often you say things like, maybe I'm wrong, or I don't know anymore, or I could be misremembering. Those phrases don't come from humility. They come from repeated invalidation. The goal is not to prove you wrong, but to make you unsure. When someone controls the story, they control the outcome. If they can rewrite what happened, they can escape responsibility for how you felt. If they can redefine the conversation, they never have to acknowledge harm. And the more you doubt your memory, the more authority their version seems to carry. This is why changing the story is such a powerful tactic. It shifts the conversation away from behavior and onto perception. Instead of discussing what they did, you are now debating whether it happened at all. And once reality itself becomes the argument, the original issue is already lost. Emotional overload is one of the fastest ways to shut down clear thinking. When too many feelings are activated at once, logic takes a back seat and survival mode takes over. In toxic communication, this overload is often intentional. The goal is not to discuss one issue, but to flood the conversation with intensity so your nervous system becomes overwhelmed. Once that happens, clarity disappears and reactions replace reason. You may notice how quickly conversations escalate. A simple concern turns emotional within seconds. The tone shifts, the pace increases, and suddenly multiple issues are being brought up at once. Accusations stack on top of each other. Old mistakes resurface. Irrelevant topics enter the discussion. Your mind struggles to track what is happening because there is too much input coming too fast. When emotions spike, your body responds before your brain can process. Heart rate increases. Muscles tense. In that state, it becomes difficult to recall facts, choose words carefully, or stay grounded in your point. This biological response is not weakness, it is human, and it's exactly what emotional overload exploits. Narcissistic toxicity thrives on this chaos. When you are emotionally flooded, you are easier to manipulate. You may raise your voice, stumble over words, or react defensively. Those reactions are then used against you. The conversation shifts from what was said to how you said it. Your emotional response becomes the distraction that removes focus from their behavior. Another layer of overload comes through contradiction. They may show hurt while accusing you. They may express anger while claiming to be calm. Mixed emotional signals confuse your instincts. You don't know whether to defend yourself, comfort them, or stand your ground. That internal conflict drains mental energy and weakens your ability to respond intentionally. Over time, repeated emotional flooding conditions you to anticipate stress before conversations even begin. You enter discussions already tense, already bracing for impact. This anticipatory anxiety lowers your threshold even further. It takes less pressure for you to feel overwhelmed while they remain seemingly composed. Once overwhelmed, people often default to two responses: appeasement or withdrawal. You may agree just to end the conversation. You may apologize even when you don't fully understand what you did wrong. Or you may shut down entirely, going quiet to protect yourself. Either response benefits the toxic dynamic because it avoids accountability and reinforces control. Emotional overload also prevents memory formation. When the nervous system is activated, details become harder to store accurately. After the conversation, you may struggle to recall what was said or in what order. This makes later reflection difficult and increases self-doubt. You know something felt wrong, but you can't organize it clearly enough to trust yourself. The overload keeps you reactive instead of reflective. Instead of choosing your words, you are responding to emotional pressure. Instead of setting boundaries, you are managing intensity. Instead of solving a problem, you are trying to survive the conversation. This tactic is effective because it creates urgency where none is needed. Everything feels immediate, dramatic, and high stakes. You feel forced to respond quickly rather than thoughtfully. That urgency bypasses discernment and pushes you into emotional compliance. When communication consistently leaves you drained, scattered, and confused, it is often because your emotional capacity is being overwhelmed on purpose. Clear conversations create calm. Toxic ones create chaos, and chaos makes it nearly impossible to think straight. Circular arguments are not misunderstandings that accidentally go nowhere. They are structured to exhaust you. You enter the conversation believing that if you explain yourself clearly enough, the issue will finally be resolved. You answer the same questions repeatedly, restate your point in different ways, and keep engaging because you expect progress. But progress never comes because resolution was never the goal. The conversation loops endlessly. The same accusation returns no matter how many times you address it. Each answer you give becomes the reason for another question. Each clarification opens the door to a new criticism. You may even hear phrases like, "That's not what I meant," or "You're missing the point," even though the point keeps changing. The discussion feels active, yet nothing actually moves forward. This looping drains mental energy. Your brain works harder trying to track the discussion, remember what has already been addressed, and avoid contradicting yourself. Fatigue sets in quickly. As exhaustion grows, your ability to think clearly weakens. You may begin conceding just to stop the cycle, not because you agree, but because you're too tired to continue. Circular arguments also create the illusion that you are the one causing the problem. Because the conversation continues, it can feel like something about your explanation is insufficient. You assume that if you could just say it better, the argument would end. That belief keeps you engaged far longer than is healthy. The repetition is intentional. Each loop resets the emotional intensity while erasing the progress that was made. Even when you reach a moment of agreement, it disappears minutes later. The same issue reappears as if nothing was ever discussed. This prevents closure and keeps the dynamic unresolved. Another exhausting element is how responsibility is avoided. When the conversation circles endlessly, accountability is never reached. The focus stays on discussion rather than action. Talking replaces resolution. Debating replaces change. As long as the argument continues, they never have to acknowledge harm or modify behavior. Circular arguments also distort time. What feels like a short discussion turns into hours of emotional labor. You walk away mentally depleted, replaying the conversation in your head, trying to identify where it went wrong. That rumination extends the exhaustion long after the conversation ends. Over time, you may notice how your confidence declines. Repeating yourself without being heard communicates an unspoken message that your words don't matter. Being misunderstood again and again begins to feel personal. You start doubting your communication skills instead of questioning the dynamic itself. The constant looping also trains you to stay engaged even when the conversation becomes unhealthy. You learn to tolerate frustration, dismissal, and confusion as normal parts of communication. This normalizing of dysfunction makes it harder to recognize when a discussion should stop. Circular arguments are powerful because they consume your resources without giving anything back. They take time, energy, and emotional presence while offering no resolution in return. The exhaustion they create lowers your defenses. When you're tired, boundaries blur. When you're drained, compliance becomes easier. By keeping the conversation spinning, they remain in control without appearing dominant. You are busy trying to finish a conversation that was never designed to end. Mixed signals create one of the strongest emotional traps in toxic dynamics. One moment there is warmth, attention, and validation. The next moment there is distance, criticism, or silence. This inconsistency keeps you off balance. You never fully know where you stand, and that uncertainty pulls your focus toward them. Instead of feeling secure, you stay alert, constantly trying to read the emotional temperature. When kindness appears unexpectedly, it feels rewarding. It brings relief after tension. That relief can be mistaken for connection, even though it only exists because discomfort came first. Over time, your mind begins associating their approval with emotional safety. You start chasing those brief positive moments, hoping your behavior will bring them back. This push and pull pattern creates dependency. You may find yourself adjusting your tone, your words, and even your personality in an attempt to maintain the good version of the relationship. The inconsistency teaches you that stability is conditional. Affection becomes something to earn rather than something freely given. Mixed signals also confuse accountability. When hurtful behavior is followed by kindness, it blurs the impact of what happened. You question whether it was really that bad. You wonder if you misinterpreted it. The emotional whiplash makes it difficult to hold both experiences at once. The positive moments overshadow the harm. Keeping the cycle intact, this inconsistency forces you into constant analysis. You replay conversations looking for clues. You monitor mood changes. You try to predict what version of them will show up next. That mental vigilance consumes energy and increases anxiety. You are no longer present in the relationship, you are managing it. Because approval is unpredictable, it becomes powerful. When something is inconsistent, the brain treats it as more valuable. This psychological effect strengthens attachment even when the relationship is unhealthy. You work harder not because the connection is strong, but because the reward is uncertain. Mixed signals also prevent honest communication. When warmth appears after conflict, you may avoid bringing up issues again for fear of losing it. You stay quiet to preserve peace. Silence becomes a strategy for survival rather than a choice. The inconsistency often comes with denial. If you point out the emotional swings, they may minimize them or blame stress, circumstances, or you. This makes the pattern harder to name. Without clear acknowledgement, the confusion deepens. Over time, your sense of self begins to shift. You measure your worth through their responses. A good day feels like success. A cold response feels like failure. Your emotional state becomes tied to their behavior rather than your own stability. The most damaging part is how normalized the confusion becomes. You begin believing that relationships are supposed to feel uncertain, that love requires anxiety, that peace must be earned through effort. What once felt uncomfortable slowly becomes familiar. Mixed signals are not about indecision, they are about influence. Inconsistency keeps you focused outward instead of inward. As long as you are trying to decode their behavior, you are not questioning whether the dynamic is healthy. The uncertainty keeps you attached, engaged, and seeking approval rather than clarity. Provoking reactions is one of the most effective ways to escape responsibility. Instead of addressing behavior directly, they apply pressure until you respond emotionally. The provocation may be subtle at first: a dismissive look, a sarcastic comment, a deliberate misunderstanding, or a quiet boundary violation. Each action is small enough to deny, yet strong enough to trigger frustration. When you finally react, the focus immediately shifts. Your response becomes the center of the conversation. The original issue disappears. What mattered moments ago is no longer discussed. Instead, attention turns to your tone, your volume, your words, or your emotional state. The narrative changes from what they did to how you reacted. Accountability dissolves as the spotlight moves away from their behavior. This tactic relies on emotional pressure building over time. One comment alone might not provoke a reaction, but repeated disregard accumulates. Each ignored boundary adds tension. Each invalidating response increases frustration. Eventually, the emotional weight becomes too heavy to hold quietly. When you speak up strongly, the reaction appears sudden to anyone watching from the outside. Once the reaction happens, it is used as proof. They frame themselves as calm and rational while portraying you as unstable or aggressive. This reversal can be deeply disorienting. You entered the conversation seeking resolution, yet now you are defending your character. The harm that led to the reaction is never addressed. Provocation also creates fear around expressing emotion. After being criticized for reacting, you may begin suppressing your feelings altogether. You hesitate before speaking, worrying that any emotion will be used against you. This emotional restraint benefits the toxic dynamic because silence prevents challenge. Another layer of manipulation appears when they label your reaction. Words like dramatic, sensitive, angry, or irrational replace the original topic. Once labeled, your experience is dismissed. The label becomes more important than the context that created it. Over time, this pattern trains you to tolerate more disrespect. You learn that expressing discomfort leads to punishment through blame. You become quieter, more cautious, and increasingly self-monitoring. Meanwhile, the provoking behavior continues because it faces no consequences. This dynamic also reinforces self-doubt. You may begin questioning whether your reactions are justified at all. You replay the moment wondering if you overreacted, ignoring the buildup that preceded it. The long pattern of provocation fades while the single reaction is magnified. Provoking reactions is powerful because it creates a false moral high ground. By triggering emotional responses, they appear reasonable in comparison. Calmness becomes a performance rather than a reflection of fairness. Control is maintained not through truth, but through optics. This tactic ensures that responsibility is always redirected. Every conversation becomes about managing your emotions instead of examining their behavior. As long as the focus remains on your reaction, the cause is never addressed. The cycle continues because the provocation remains hidden while the response is visible. What happens beneath the surface is ignored, and only the emotional moment is remembered. This imbalance keeps you explaining yourself while they avoid accountability altogether. Your clarity threatens their control because clarity removes confusion, and confusion is where manipulation survives. When you are grounded in what you know, what you feel, and what you will tolerate, their influence weakens. Toxic dynamics rely on uncertainty. The moment you become certain within yourself, the dynamic begins to shift. Clarity means you recognize patterns instead of isolated incidents. You stop viewing each conversation as separate and start seeing repetition. You notice how accountability is avoided, how blame is redirected, how confusion appears at predictable moments. Pattern recognition makes manipulation visible, and visibility removes its power. This awareness often changes how you respond. You speak less, not because you are afraid, but because you no longer feel the need to over-explain. You stop defending every accusation. You no longer chase understanding from someone who benefits from misunderstanding. This shift alone can feel threatening to someone who relies on emotional reactions for control. When clarity increases, emotional hooks lose effectiveness. Guilt no longer lands the same way. Shame no longer overrides your judgment. You can feel emotion without surrendering to it. That emotional independence disrupts the familiar cycle. This is why pushback often intensifies when you become clearer. The dynamic resists change. You may notice increased criticism, attempts to provoke reactions, or efforts to reintroduce doubt. These are not signs that you are doing something wrong. They are signs that the previous methods are no longer working. Clarity also strengthens boundaries. Boundaries do not require long explanations. They rely on certainty. When you know what you will and will not engage with, you stop negotiating your limits. That firmness can feel uncomfortable to someone accustomed to flexibility they can exploit. Another threat clarity presents is consistency. When your responses become predictable and calm, manipulation loses leverage. Chaos thrives on emotional variation. Stability removes the emotional highs and lows that fuel control. Without dramatic reactions, their tactics fall flat. As clarity grows, your internal reference point shifts inward. You rely less on their approval and more on your own judgment. This independence disrupts the imbalance of power. Influence weakens when validation is no longer the currency. Clarity also brings discernment. You can distinguish between disagreement and disrespect. You can hear criticism without absorbing blame. You can acknowledge mistakes without surrendering your identity. This balanced perspective makes manipulation easier to detect and easier to disengage from. The threat is not confrontation but detachment. When you stop arguing with distortion, it has nothing to feed on. When you stop defending reality, you reclaim energy that was once drained by confusion. As your clarity strengthens, conversations shorten. You no longer participate in endless debates. You recognize when resolution is impossible. You choose peace over persuasion. This refusal to engage destabilizes dynamics built on emotional entanglement. Control depends on access to your uncertainty. When that uncertainty fades, so does their influence. Your clarity becomes the boundary they cannot cross, the stability they cannot disrupt, and the presence they cannot manipulate. Calm boundaries dismantle confusion because they remove emotion from the exchange without removing strength. Boundaries are not arguments, explanations, or attempts to convince. They are quiet decisions about what you will participate in and what you will not. When delivered calmly, they deny toxic communication the fuel it depends on. Confusion thrives in emotional engagement. The more you explain, defend, justify, or react, the more material there is to distort. Calm boundaries reduce that material. They shorten conversations. They limit access. They make interactions predictable and grounded. A calm boundary sounds simple, but simplicity is powerful. It does not chase agreement. It does not attempt to prove innocence. It states a limit and stands there. When confusion is used as a tactic, clarity through brevity becomes protection. What makes calm boundaries effective is consistency. Saying the same thing the same way without escalation removes the emotional variation manipulation relies on. When responses do not change, attempts to provoke lose momentum. The dynamic cannot spin if one side refuses to move. Boundaries also protect your nervous system. When you no longer engage in circular explanations, your body remains regulated. Regulation supports clear thinking. Clear thinking strengthens boundaries further. This creates stability that counters chaos. At first, calm boundaries may feel unnatural. You may feel rude, cold, or dismissive because you are used to over-functioning emotionally. But boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity expressed without hostility. When confusion is met with calm, it exposes itself. Manipulation depends on emotional participation. Without it, the tactic becomes visible. Silence after a boundary is often more powerful than words because it interrupts the pattern. Another strength of calm boundaries is that they shift focus from persuasion to choice. You are no longer trying to make someone understand. You are deciding how much access they have to you. This internal shift restores agency. Boundaries also redefine communication success. Success is no longer being understood or agreed with. Success becomes staying aligned with yourself. This removes the pressure to resolve what cannot be resolved. As boundaries remain steady, emotional exhaustion decreases. Conversations no longer spiral. You leave interactions with energy instead of confusion. The reduction in chaos reinforces your confidence in your judgment. Calm boundaries also teach others how to engage with you. They establish a new pattern. Some people adapt, others resist. Resistance is not failure, it simply reveals who benefited from the absence of limits. The power of calm is that it cannot be twisted easily. Raised voices can be labeled emotional. Long explanations can be distorted. Calm statements stand firm. They offer little room for reinterpretation. When boundaries are clear, confusion loses its leverage. The conversation either stays respectful or it ends. Both outcomes protect your clarity. You are no longer pulled into fog. You are no longer debating reality. You are choosing presence, simplicity, and self-trust in every interaction. Confusion is not weakness, and clarity is not confrontation. When toxicity enters communication, it rarely announces itself openly. It disguises itself as misunderstanding, emotional intensity, shifting stories, endless debates, mixed signals, and reactions pulled from you rather than chosen by you. Each tactic serves the same purpose: to keep you uncertain, emotionally drained, and disconnected from your own inner authority. The moment you recognize these patterns, the dynamic begins to change. You stop searching for the perfect words. You stop trying to explain your truth to someone committed to distorting it. You realize that healthy communication brings understanding, not fog, and peace, not constant self-doubt. Clarity restores power because it returns you to yourself. It allows you to trust what you see, what you feel, and what you know. With clarity, manipulation becomes visible. With boundaries, confusion loses its grip. With calm, chaos has nothing to attach to. You don't win by arguing better. You win by staying grounded. You don't regain control by proving reality. You regain it by refusing to abandon it. When confusion no longer pulls you off center, toxicity loses its advantage, and your peace stops being negotiable.